Are those the people you most want to be like, or would you rather be like a Marcus Aurelius? Maybe that's dispositional then. Maybe some people just Stoicism appeals to some people and it doesn't appeal to others. But I guess the disposition that makes you want to be like Marcus Aurelius, I don't think is the disposition of a coward.
Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about risk. Not the board game, but the concept of risk. Um, really the role it plays in our lives and our decision making and how Stoicism can help us think about risk and transform the way that we approach, the way that we think about danger, the way that we think about cost, the way we think about trade-offs and things like this. I wanted to jump into this because uh, I think that a large part of Stoicism's benefit, as someone who's been practicing it for a while, I mean, Caleb, you've been doing this too, but I think for me, a large part of Stoicism's benefits long term. So not just in kind of a short term moment. Well, I'm stressed now. I can think about the dichotomy of control, or I can use the view from above to resolve my stress about some acute issue. But in terms of the way that I plan my life, a large part of the benefits of Stoicism has been changing the way that I think about risk. And so I want to dig into that a bit and focus on that topic. Another thing I also want to think about is about this idea of risk tolerance. And, does Stoicism increase our risk tolerance, or is it a way of, and maybe a criticism against Stoicism is that it is kind of the philosophy for the people with the least amount of risk tolerance, and kind of exploring that criticism of Stoicism from that angle. Yeah. Anything you wanted to add before we jump into it?
Nice, excellent. Some other words by way of intro is Stoicism helps us think about risk, uh, manage it better, one might say. And it also provides this reminder that, in a way, risk is unavoidable. And, we have these related ideas. Seneca talks a lot about fortune, and he has this nice line that, no man has ever been so far advanced by fortune that she did not threaten him as greatly as she had previously indulged him. You have these ideas of risk, payoff from bets, uh, exposure to danger, but also that sense that prosperity, adversity, they come and go. So there's a lot to talk about here, and it's certainly true that both philosophically and practically, the Stoics gave us a lot to think about in terms of managing risk in our own lives.
Yeah. And I'm aware that, totally agree. And I'm aware that risk doesn't necessarily sound like it sounds like an abstract concept, but it's not, right? It's something that it's really what we use to make decisions all the time. We make trade-offs between different options. We don't do certain things if we think they're too risky. And so it really is this concept that I think informs a lot of how we live. People think about it a lot in terms of financial decision making, but I think it's a big part of how we make any sort of decisions. And I want to dig into how Stoicism relates to that. So let's do it.
Awesome.
Cool. So the first thing I want to do, again, like any good philosophy podcast, I want to start off with the definition. So I just define risk, and I think I just got this off Google, as a situation that involves exposure to danger. So risk, we're going to define risk as a situation that involves exposure to danger. So something is risky if it involves the potential, maybe not the guarantee, doesn't need to be a guarantee, I should say. It could be guaranteed, but if it involves the potential for danger, and you can say, well, what's danger? But I think of, something you'd prefer not to happen, some sort of harm, some sort of bad thing occurring.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the first things about Stoicism, I built these kind of propositions one by one that I'll go through in this episode. One of the first things about Stoicism is that Stoicism teaches us that we necessarily will be and should be anxious around risk. So one way you can think about Stoicism was, well, Stoicism teaches us not to care about risk, not to be worried about bad things, and that's not what Stoicism teaches us. Stoicism teaches that we feel and we will necessarily feel it depending on what we think. And if we think something is risky, we will be anxious about it. And so the Stoics defined fear as, the anticipation of a potential harm, something along those lines. And so I think that when you recognize that something bad might happen, you will experience fear. So I think the Stoics teach that we will necessarily be anxious around what we identify as risk. So a life of risk, a life where you expose yourself to risk, will be a life of corresponding anxiety and fear, as long as we think there is a genuine danger. So that's a kind of, I think, a counterintuitive idea. The Stoics don't teach us to be brave in front of risk. They don't teach us that we shouldn't care about risk. They say, well, you will be fearful, and you should be fearful in the face of risk. So that's point number one, and that's an interesting. I think it's just counterintuitive to what some people might think. What do you think?
Well, it gets tricky with some of this language because I would say Stoics tell us to be brave in front of risk, but that doesn't mean that you're completely immune to any feeling of fear. That's natural and normal. And then you should even exercise what the Stoics would call, in their taxonomy of positive emotions. You should feel cautious in the presence of genuine risk. And I think usually they'll use a word that's translated sort of as caution, right? It would be a mistake to say caution just involves keeping a completely cool head and experiencing stillness of mind in the face of danger. No, for yeah, I think in a real sense, caution does involve anxiety, but perhaps it's not this full like the full form of anxiety as many people imagine it. It is different, but it does have a sense of negative feelings associated with it and a real recognition if you're facing an actual danger. And we'll talk more about this, what how Stoics think about how to classify things as dangerous or not. Uh, that there's a real possibility of harm
Mhm.
there, and that does carry with it some amount of negative feeling.
Well, I think you got me on the first one. I think I think I agree with you. Um, we will feel. So maybe to clarify something like this, fear and anxiety is going to be disproportional. It's going to be a negative emotion because it's going to be disproportional. Even though it's identifying something we should be cautious about, we're going to be a bit too extreme. So it becomes fear. It becomes this passionate response. But we will at least be cautious. So we Stoicism says that we should at least, in the best case, be cautious around fear, or around risk, I should say. Sorry. In the worst case, be anxious and fearful. So just being more precise with our language there, I would agree with that.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, that makes sense to me. But it doesn't. And I think you make a good distinction, which is to say we should be courageous in that we should follow through with the correct plan of action, but we shouldn't be careless, and we shouldn't be without caution, as you say. So,
Mhm.
so a life of risk is not a carefree life, even for a Stoic. A life of risk is a very cautious life. And yeah, to be precise, we want to avoid that caution from slipping into fear, or these kind of extreme feelings. But it is a cautious life. It's not a carefree life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think you can talk about. We use words like fear and anxiety in a number of different ways. So colloquially, I think you certainly could get away with saying some
I think
amount of anxiety, fear
yeah, I
does
think
make sense because some ways in which we use those words I think does actually properly capture the stoic view, especially when they refer just to feelings, not judgments, that
mhm.
immediate experience of fear, that's not reflective, or that sort of anxious feeling in one's stomach. There's a way to experience that without, I think, the corresponding judgment. So anyway, I think that's all that's just say is, I think using that language isn't completely wrong, but perhaps there's some amount of imprecision.
Yeah, there's that we've got the contemporary English use of fear and anxiety, and that part of that graphs on to what the Stoics would describe as caution. Part of that graphs on to, as you said, the kind of natural feelings you're going to experience before they turn into judgments.
Hmm.
And then part of that graphs on to passionate responses. And the Stoic is not forced into a life of passionate responses, but certainly some things we identify as fear or anxiety or nervousness or hyper awareness today would correspond to actually kind of a healthy amount of caution in the Stoics view.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Maybe, or just make that, maybe we'll jump into this a little bit more, but maybe to make that more concrete, is in business, there's that phrase, the paranoid always survive. And then
mhm,
there's sort of like, the cultivation of paranoia, and maybe some businesses or some leaders might think about as an exercise, how can I be more paranoid about my business? And you think maybe that's the kind of potential, like the kind of attitude that a Stoic would think is healthy,
mhm,
jumping into that mindset for the sake of building a better business, uh, and to combat other passionate emotions that might be more on the positive side, overconfidence, and so on.
mhm. Yeah, I think that sounds right to me. So rephrasing that first one of Stoicism teaches us we'll necessarily be cautious or we'll experience a kind of awareness around risk. We're not immune to risk. Risk is going to be a part of our life regardless, and we should respond to it even as Stoics. But the second idea here is that Stoicism's real benefit is that it lets us identify the correct kind of risk. So it asks us to deprioritize external risks. So losing money, damaged reputation, losing your property, um, these kinds of things that are outside of our outside of ourselves, outside of the things that are up to us, as Epictetus would say. And it asks us to prioritize internal risk. That's like acting poorly. So the Stoic says, look, you should be cautious. I'm happy to use the word cautious. You should be very cautious around risk. Risk is something we really want to pay attention to, but all these things you think are risks, um, not being well liked by these group of people who don't matter to you. They're not family. They're just strangers. Um, not ending up being able to keep up with the Joneses in terms of your possessions. Those are not actual risks. Those aren't the things that actually put you in a position of having a bad life. The things that put you in the real risk is that you end up like a bad person. The real risk is you end up like a jerk, selfish. You're not kind to others. You're not particularly nice. And you are also unhappy because you compare yourself to others. You're jealous. You desire things that are outside of your control. And so that's the real risk. And so there is not a well, I don't care about what happens, but actually just a recontextualization about what it really is dangerous for the individual, what really is bad for you. And so we want to direct that caution, away from the typical targets, which are these external things which are outside of our control, and towards this internal target of saying, well, what really puts me in danger is being a bad person. What really leads to a good life is being a good person. Um, And so you think about some of the ways that they help you deprioritize external risk. For example, things like amor fati, which is like loving fate, accepting what happens to you. Things like premeditatio malorum, imagining the bad things that can occur outside of your control. Those are ways that they teach you to train yourself, not just to numb yourself to those external harms or external things that could happen, but to also recognize that you'd be okay even if they happen, and you can still flourish even if they happen. So that's that second idea, is that shifting of what actually constitutes a real risk to a person.
Yeah, I think that's probably that's going to be the key Stoic shift when thinking about risk. And I think thinking about premeditatio malorum, that's an interesting exercise, and I think like a lot of Stoic exercises has different levels to it. So what that is essentially just involving bad scenarios that could happen. If you go back to that business example, what if my
Yeah.
favorite coworker leaves? What if the market has a severe downturn? And there are a few different reasons to do that, and I think often the first two we mentioned is that first, that's just good planning. It has positive practical upshot in terms of thinking through different scenarios, what you'll practically do if they occur, and then also thinking through, how can I prevent that? How can I make that less likely that, my favorite coworker leaves and so on. Another key reason to do it is to sort of psychologically prepare yourself for the fact that it might occur and not, avoid a kind of unrealistic optimism, seeing reality as, such that no bad things are going to happen, or just coasting until they do. But there's also the upshot that I think it's a way to internalize Stoic value theory, where by practicing premeditatio malorum, another focus is not just on preparation, not just on sort of building up psychological resilience, but really internalizing that if these things happened and you aren't acting vicious, you were doing the best you could, nothing bad
Hmm.
occurred to you. It's sort of like, like that Epictetus story where he's talking to the student and he says, the student says something like, this man went to jail and it was terrible for him. And Epictetus said, no, it's this man went to jail. That's all you need to say. That other bit that is terrible for him, that's added by you. And that, I think, practicing premeditatio malorum is a way of internalizing that, seeing bad circumstances, if they concern the external, as not bad, and internalizing Stoic philosophy that way.
Yes, you're arguing for this kind of level one, level two. Level one is, well, it just helps you plan, helps you anticipate, helps you not be caught off guard. And then level two is actually internalizing the value that, hey, nothing bad has actually happened. If I think about what happens if I lose my job, nothing has stopped my capacity to flourish. Nothing has stopped my capacity to be a good person in that situation. Um, and so an actual bad thing has not occurred. And so that internalization of that value theory, I think you're absolutely right. That's the higher level. That's again what makes the Stoic things so useful. Is you could draw the same analogy of the dichotomy of control. There's this like lower level application of it, which is just in any moment what's up to you and what's not, and focus on what's up to you. And then there's the second level, which is, well, you should focus on the things that are up to you because those are the things that actually matter. So there's that second level of it that gets into the Stoic value of really putting the importance on your character over these external things. I think that's absolutely right.
Yep.
Um, and so, well, I mean, an interesting example here that I wanted to raise. So this idea is that, that we're shifting away from these external risks and we're focusing on internal risks. Shifting our focus away from, having a bad reputation and towards, was I kind to other people? So it reminds me of this example from Plato's Republic, which is one of the most important books ever written, where Socrates asks this question: is it better to do good and be perceived as evil? So is it better to be this nice, genuine, kind person that's framed for murder? Or is it better to do evil and be perceived as good? So be the person that does the murdering, goes around stealing, but is popular, well respected, and loved. And that's such a Stoic question. And that's this exact example of where do you place risk, right? If you go out and you steal and you murder, is the risk getting caught, or is the risk doing the bad thing? Is that the bad part, or was the bad part getting caught, having poor reputation, losing your freedom because you go to jail? And so I think that is like the perfect way of framing that Stoic shift in terms of risk, which is to say, you're a Stoic when you think it's better to do good and be perceived as evil than to do evil and be perceived as good. Because in that sense, you've internalized, well, the thing that matters is not harmed. I'm still doing good, even if I'm being perceived as evil. Um, and I think it's just cool that distinction there. You find that foreshadowed in Plato as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of this idea that it's better to be the the person of virtue and not, say, have positions of power. One of those themes from Socrates that the Stoics really steal and run with and make a core part of their
Mm-hmm.
philosophy. This emphasis on virtue and that being necessary and sufficient for the good life. And I suppose, what that means when it comes to the discussion of risk is that risk, that's exposure to danger. And then what that means for the Stoics is danger, something that can harm you, is shifted from these external concerns to the internal, in terms of what really will harm you is making poor decisions and judgments. That's what you want to avoid. You want to avoid making those mistakes and avoid putting yourself in situations where you make those kinds of mistakes, because that ultimately leads to unhappiness. And that's where the focus is, not so much on these external things, these outcomes, these results, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Socrates has another line, which was very controversial at the time, about how it's better to experience harm than to do harm. If somebody's going to get robbed, it's better to be the person that gets robbed than to do the robbing. And that's that same claim of, what leads to happiness is a good character, not this kind of success in these external things. Not that we should uh, not that we should give up unnecessarily success in external things, but just if you had to choose, you'd always choose a good character over the external success. And that's a very classic Stoic argument. And you point to these, again, Plato does this in the Republic. You point to these tyrants. Today, we could look at the celebrity millionaires who are crashing their cars and getting in scandals in their relationships. And you think, well, do I want a life like that? And the answer is no, because, you've traded, uh, traded a solid, grounded character for external success, and that's not a trade worth making. Basically, is the Stoic argument. Um, but yeah, I think you summarized it really well, which is that it's thinking differently about danger. If risk is exposure to danger, we're just reconceptualizing what danger is. Another follow up from that is that I think that Stoicism doesn't then teach risk tolerance. It more eliminates a certain kind of risk. And I should caveat that. I guess what it does is it teaches, because it depends on how we define risk tolerance, but it teaches us, I should say, um, almost like a dichotomy of tolerance, which is, maybe we'll start saying that instead of the dichotomy of control. Maybe it'll catch on. I don't think so,
I don't
but
think so.
which is to say that you should be incredibly tolerant to external risk, at least the possibility of external risk. That quote you gave from Seneca about, fortune having this ability to ruin things, to change things at a moment's notice. Um, but we should be very intolerant to internal risk. We should be very cautious about situations, people, circumstances that put our character at risk. That's not something we can afford to jeopardize. That's not something we can afford to play with the same way we can play with external risk. How do you think about that? This idea that, maybe we become really tolerant to that external kind, but then actually very intolerant, very kind of sensitive to internal risk.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think it's important to maybe think about different examples where someone exemplifies the incorrect, the unstoic attitude towards risk, and maybe that'll help tease this out. So, like, on one hand, you can think of the person who refuses to engage with the world, whether that's in physical activity, romantic relationships, because they're afraid of getting hurt. And I think you can see how that person just clearly doesn't have a stoic attitude towards risk. They sit on the sidelines because they believe their well-being is invested in, their physical health, their romantic status, and so on. So that person's clearly not stoic. But you can also think about someone who the classic Aristotelian example, I suppose, would just be is reckless. They have internalized part of the Stoic message in a way where they don't care about outcomes, uh, as much, but you still need to you need to making good decisions and judgments, and to some extent what happens is a measuring stick of how well you're doing. It's giving you some information. So if if you're someone who is not afraid of getting physically injured but keeps on finding yourself in say you're running or something like this, you keep on hurting yourself after running too long, that you're being reckless and that the internal has actually gone astray. So I'm sure there's a tighter way to put this, but there is a kind of, in the shift to the internal, you need to be careful that internal doesn't just mean you just make your decisions in your own little world. Really, it means not investing your well-being in some of these external features we've discussed, but what it is to make good decisions, good judgments, and so on, is to align in some sense with the world, with reality, and so the external can't completely fall away.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was trying to think of the simpler way to say that. We, there's two types of non-stoics. The non-stoic who's so afraid of everything, they hide themselves away. And then the person who is reckless, as you said, and says, I don't care if I go out and get hit by a car because what matters is my character. And it's some sort of distorted part of stoicism, right? Where they're like, I don't care if I lose a hand or break a leg or, just give away all my money because all that matters is the kind of person I am. And there's something off there, but I think you hit it. What's off there is that speaks to kind of an inconsistent character, speaks to a reckless character. It's your performance in the external world is giving you some, probably one of the most reliable forms of feedback about your internal character. Um, but I guess there's another point there, which is also about chance, which is to say that I think the Stoic is very tolerant towards chance, which is to say, I'm going to I'm going to make a bet on something. I'm going to try something that might fail. Um, but I'm okay with that percentage chance that it fails. And then in that way, you decide to commit to being a musician or something. And you're saying, this is something I want to do. This is, I think, an expression of my talents, but there's a chance I won't become a professional musician. That's a kind of risk, an external risk that the way typical people would think about it. They think that's a very risky venture. And what the Stoic would say is that they would say, um, the actual the actual downsides of that going wrong, the actual downsides of you not becoming a potential professional, is rather low. There's something there about chance, that we approach chance differently, in that you should still make an intelligent decision. I mean, that's the classic Stoic thing, right? Which is like, make an intelligent decision, but not be destroyed if the coin comes up tails, right?
I think that's right. It's when you're thinking about chance, the relevant considerations for becoming a musician are things like you can take the role ethics type approach to it. Are you in a situation where you can go without income for a number of years, or do you have dependents? If you have dependents, that's not going to be likely. It's not going to be a good decision. And there's also your own personal fit. Some people are delusional about their musical abilities. Are you one of those people? And it's honestly hard to tell, because even the best musicians had some people, I'm sure many people, tell them that they didn't have a chance. But you need to have that discerning judgment to either have that well-grounded confidence in yourself while avoiding delusion. Um, and then suppose those things all go right, there's still that chance that you get unlucky. Maybe the kind of style a musician plays in just becomes out of fashion for some freak reason, or maybe even technological development, I imagine, heavily influence some musicians' trajectories. In that case, that's, I think, the kind of risk that I think the Stoics should say you should account for. You should account for that kind of thing to the extent that you can. But if things go wrong and you still did your best, then it doesn't influence your life in a real sense. What matters is whether you did your best and making your judgments, making excellent decisions, and so on,
Yeah.
uh,
Okay.
and performing. Yeah.
I think to build on this, I think there's something. Yeah, there's something that I think about from in investment theory. This comes from the Rational Reminder podcast, which I'm a big fan of. Which is this idea that like what determines the quality of a decision is not the outcome. What determines the quality of a decision is, was that the correct choice? Were you aware of the potential for success and the potential for failure? Did you take that into consideration? And was that, all things considered, the right course of action given what you want out of life and your investments, um, compared to other choices? Something like this. And I think that's something that I think that Stoicism encapsulates totally, which is this idea that like what determines whether or not a choice was risky is not the outcome. It's like, did you make a good choice at the outset? Did you consider, as you said, did you consider if you're delusional? Did you consider your relationship with other people? Did you consider your actual likelihood of succeeding? And once you've calculated that and you've made that choice, then the quality of the choice is locked in, the quality of the decision is locked in, and then you try your best. That's locked in. And then if it ends up failing, as you said, it is not that big of a deal. Certainly not compared to the way other schools would think about it. Where something like, you take something like Epicureanism, if you come up wrong there and you experience less pleasure than you could have, well, then yeah, you made a big mistake. Or you think something like Aristotelianism or utilitarianism, which kind of build in the quality of the decision, I guess, has the outcome built into it in a way.
Mhm.
Or you can't evaluate, and this is what Aristotle says, right? About like, you can't tell if somebody had a good life until after they died. It's like, you can't tell if you made a good decision until after the result. And then I think in Stoicism, it's like, no, the quality of a decision is locked in before once you roll the dice. And then what the dice come up, that doesn't determine the quality of the decision, which means that didn't determine the quality of your character making that decision, which means, you're going to have to adjust to it, but it's not really what's important. What's important was if you were making an informed decision in the right way for the right reasons.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Absolutely. I think that's a good way to put it.
Cool. And then that builds on this other thing, which is that I think that one thing Stoicism offers is it offers a life of the greatest possible reward, happiness. Like it offers the full 10 out of 10 that every other school offers, but it offers the lowest possible risk because it minimizes or eliminates an entire category of risk, which is this external risk. And so it offers the same it offers the same high as everybody else while minimizing the low. And so I think about something like I just said, Aristotelianism or Epicureanism. They have risk built into it, which is to say, some people just have bad lives. Doesn't matter
Mhm.
what you do under these ways of thinking. Some people that person who, he was a nice person, but his family got sick, and then he was framed for a crime he didn't commit, and then he suffered in jail. That person just had a bad life, right? Like that person, the overall quality of that person's life is exposed to risk and to luck outside of their control.
Mhm.
And then the Stoics just entirely eliminate that category, but they don't eliminate that category at the. I guess that's one thing to say, is that they don't eliminate that type of outcome at the expense of uh, happiness. They still think that that full happiness is accessible to us, and that full quality of life is accessible to us. Um, and so that, yeah, I guess that's the twist, is that, yeah, if you want exposure to full good with minimization of bad, Stoicism seems like the obvious choice.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what it does is it says that happiness is available to everyone, no matter your circumstances, and in that sense, it's fundamentally egalitarian, unlike Aristotelianism, or perhaps even we don't talk about this example as much, but Epicureanism has possibly a similar issue. If you just happen to be someone who is born into a body that is, racked with pain, if you have chronic pain syndrome or something like this, you probably have a much harder time being an Epicurean. than others, right? The possibility of pleasure might be remote for some individuals. Um, I mean, that's not to say that Stoicism is easy by any means, and it could also might be the case that it's more difficult for others to be Stoic than it's not equally easy for everyone to be a Stoic. I think that's a little bit more controversial, but it is to say that for the Stoics, in a way, if you're thinking about this from an investment type analogy, you are secured, some of the safest high value parts of your portfolio, if you will, so long as you build up your character, so long as you pursue virtue, that's available to you, no matter who you are. And then all these other aspects of life, all these other positive aspects of life, those may come along or not. That's just all upside at that point.
Yeah, it's almost like you've got your investment portfolio of like millions and millions of dollars, and everybody has the ability to both grow that and secure that through internal decisions. And then it's like, but what about these like tokens or these like, I don't know, um, online unique stickers or something? Like there's something that's like, these are nice bonuses, but like I'm okay if I lose all of these, or I'm okay if I get a bunch of them, that's great, but it's not going to replace the rest of my savings. It's a bit of a silly example, but it's trying to make the example of how these indifferents stack up compared to the unlimited wealth of good character, as the Stoics would think about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so.
Um, I also think about this idea of moral luck, which is the idea that some people are praised or blamed, and potentially even rightly so, for things they didn't decide to do. So, if you're born, that comes back to the egalitarian point. Some people are just born with a certain disposition, let's say to be a good leader or to be courageous, um, or to be hardworking. And those people are praised and they say, wow, that person's a really great person because they're a really hardworking person. If you have a conception of virtue that's limited to a certain, it's not egalitarian. It's that some types of people are better than other types of people, knowledge aside.
Mhm.
Then there's a certain luck aspect to even the quality of your character. There's a certain luck aspect to even whether or not you have a virtue. But the Stoics don't think of virtue in that way. They think of virtue as knowledge. Do you understand what you should be courageous about, what you should be just about, in what ways you should have self control, things like this. And that kind of knowledge is available to everyone. It's an egalitarian conception of virtue, not just an egalitarian conception of what does a great life look like, but it's an egalitarian conception of virtue, which other schools might not have. The other ways of thinking might just say, well, some people are just born braver than others. Some people are just born harder working than others. And so and that's the kind of risk point zero, that point of birth, the, what circumstances you were born into, both, um, you know, dispositionally and otherwise. And the Stoics take that off the table in a way that I think is really liberating. They say, oh, that wasn't that big of a problem.
I suppose the flip side of this is that given that everyone has the opportunity for happiness or developing virtue, it's on the Stoic view, it's up to them whether they in fact seize it, or they in fact develop virtue, or up to, it's ultimately up to you, up to us. And and that comes back, I guess, to that real risk that you might not do it. And that's why why the Stoics are always encouraging you to set fire to the right things. Don't postpone the project of self improvement. Seneca has that wonderful line, ensure your vices die before you do.
Oh, nice.
Um, and that's where, that I think that really that coaching aspect, that protreptic, is that the right word I'm looking for? That
Yes, that is.
uh, that part of the Stoic program really comes into play. Where okay, so now we're as equals in virtue of our humanity. We have this possibility to be happy. Now it's up to us to go get it. And then the Stoics are, yeah, that's when they give us their encouragement, their coaching to get after it, as it were.
Well, yeah, and I guess your point. I guess your point, Caleb, is like I've made this distinction between internal risk and external risk, and I've downplayed external risk, and as if that's like as if it's fine if the only things in life are external internal risk, and you're like, well, if it's internal risk, there is still a risk that you just let yourself down. There is a risk that you don't turn yourself to a life of philosophy or cultivation, and just because you screwed yourself doesn't make it any less bad. So it's still a very real kind of risk, is what I was taking from that. And so that's why Epictetus is always yelling at us, basically. And Marcus Aurelius is writing his book to himself, and there's this constant. You've got to put the work in to eliminate the way that you can ruin your own life, basically.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Um, and so the last point I want to make here. So we've talked a lot about different ways of thinking about risk in the Stoic conception. The last point I wanted to do was bring up risk in terms of a criticism of Stoicism. So I just argued that Stoicism, I think it is the philosophy, it is the way of thinking about life that offers the greatest reward with the lowest risk. And you pointed out correctly that like that great reward is not easily achieved. There might be philosophies that offer that reward a little bit more easily, but at least it's up to us. At least it's in our control. And I think a criticism of Stoicism would be that it is a philosophy for the risk adverse. It is a philosophy for the cowards. And so to argue for it, I would say something like Stoicism. It's something that just appeals to risk adverse people. It's not true. It's just something that appeals to people that are uncomfortable with the fact that the world is a risky, dangerous place with winners and losers, and sometimes that comes up to chance, and sometimes that's unfair. It's for people who are trying to maximize the upside while limiting the downside.
Hmm.
And maybe Stoicism is the best life with no external risk, but this doesn't make it the best life. It's only the best life with no risk. It's only it's the middle road. It's the safe bet. So the Stoics shut themselves out of the highs that come with really going all in on something or feeling the rush of luck. And to go back to a financial analogy, it's the philosophy of those that will save enough for retirement but never get rich. And it's silly to you'd never look at the people that save enough for retirement and say, well, that person is financially better off than the person who got rich. Maybe they had less risk, but they certainly aren't better financially off than the person who invested in Bitcoin back in 2008, right?
Sure.
Um, and so Stoicism, again, just playing devil's advocate here, having some enjoying switching over to the other side. It's for those that want to feel numb or dull or mitigate the worst scenarios. They want to protect themselves from the downs, but in doing so, they block themselves out of the best case scenarios. And so that's it's not necessarily a good thing. And the Stoics are pretending that we still have access to the highs. Well, really, all we're doing is kind of meeting in the middle in both ways. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I wonder, if you could make it more. What are examples of people of lives, patterns of living where people have the non-stoic approach to risk that perhaps is more defensible?
I mean, I would say something like the musician example we just gave, or something like a professional athlete who you can think about this in terms of professional success. Somebody who bet on themselves and had a significant positive outcome because of that. Um, so that's an example.
Yeah, but
Um,
that's not ruled out by stoicism, right? I guess unless you think
I guess
what
that
made it possible is the investment in the external, is the belief that, the business person thought this cannot fail. If it fails, I will be a failure or something like this. It must happen. Like these sorts of thought patterns.
I guess there'd be two arguments there. One is that yes, there's certain kinds of people that won't succeed unless they go all in, and they won't go all in if they're Stoics.
Hmm.
And then the other argument would be something like, even if you succeed, you don't actually get. I mean, it would be a different argument about the nature of passions. It would say, look, like you're so afraid of feeling. Stoics are so afraid of feeling negative passions that they lock themselves out of the positive ones too. And so, even if you succeed, because you restricted your value to the internal, you didn't actually feel the full highs of that like ecstatic external success. You kind of are going through everything at like a 5 out of 10, and that at the end of the day is not the best way to live. I guess it kind of becomes there's an outcome argument, burning the ships, to use uh, Iliad metaphor. You need to. Some people need to burn the ships and really feel like I will die. My life will be over unless this happens. And then there's kind of I guess um, reincorporation of the passions, which is to say, no, you just don't want to feel passions because you're too worried about getting exposed to the bad ones. If you have good passions, if you have pleasurable passions all the time, then that's quite a good thing.
Yeah, I suppose we've talked about that first objection before in a few different podcasts. I think when you talked about the reserve clause, I think that objection really comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about the second one a little bit as well. The second one's interesting because I suppose what comes to mind there is there is at least some psychological evidence that people who limit the amount of negative emotions they feel may also be limiting in some way the amount of positive emotions they feel. There's some very limited evidence for that.
I'll take it.
Um,
In the devil's advocate
yeah,
role, I'll take it.
yeah, supports my position. Perfect. Um, but it also brings to mind, I guess, patterns of life where some people they prefer their relationships to be more emotionally volatile, and I think they and probably there is a kind of person for whom that sort of that rapturous experience is really important, and what that means is in a romantic relationship, terrible fights, terrible grief, heartache, but also that kind of euphoric sense of love on the other side, and that that promise of something that's maybe more intense than someone who I suppose you could say has a more stoic model where they aren't as um, scared, aren't as fearful of the ways things can go wrong in a relationship, and don't invest uh, themselves in it in the same way that this volatile person might.
It is. I mean, it is just an anti-stoic argument when you break it down like that, to the point where you almost can't argue against each other, because it's almost, there's something very common sense about stoicism, right? Where it's almost that, if we go back to Plato's Republic, I'm losing my devil's advocate position here because I'm reverting back to the stoic. I'm
Yeah.
losing strength. But if we go back, there's this almost common sense thing to stoicism, where it's like, well, look at those people. Look at those people who are, you know, in these passionate arguments uh, with their lovers, and then want to kill themselves, if not do kill themselves afterwards. And you think, is that the good life? Like, if you genuinely take a step back, you're like, is that the best way to live? And I think a lot of stoicism just like rests on the intuition that that's not the case. You look at Plato's argument about the tyrant in the Republic. You look at that person who gets whatever they want, and but is actually so vulnerable and fragile that if they don't get what they want, they can't emotionally handle it. Um, if they're not able to exert that perfect control, and you think, well, is that the good life? Is that the kind of person I want to be? I want to be that emotionally tumultuous king. And I think there is an intuition that just, no, that's just not the case. I'm not sure. We can go into like long arguments for that, but I think for now, just kind of resting on that intuition is a very powerful one. It's also a very Socratic way of teaching, which is just to say, if you could pick which of those people to be, would you pick to be like those people? Are those the people you most want to be like? Or would you rather be like a Marcus Aurelius? Maybe that's dispositional then. Maybe some people, just stoicism appeals to some people and it doesn't appeal to others. But I guess the disposition that makes you want to be like Marcus Aurelius, I don't think is the disposition of a coward. And so I think
Yeah, yeah,
my
yeah.
my attempt at a criticism fails there.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. It's certainly not the disposition of a coward. I think the best version of this objection is to sort of make it more precise and say, there's a kind of person for whom Stoicism isn't
Yeah.
the best fit, or it doesn't fit their nature in some sense. So you need to broaden the philosophical tent, as it were. And then I think you've already gave a kind of response to that, which is, well, look at the examples people give about these kind of emotionally volatile people. Normally they aren't ones we describe as happy. And I think it's interesting that the next defense for this argument, if you play it out, is often to point to things these unhappy people did in their lives, which is kind
Yeah.
of a distraction from their actual life. If you think about it, where, you started with emotional volatility, but then you're justifying it by reference to great works of art or something like this. Maybe there's something to be suspicious in that line of reasoning. But and maybe there is something to that. We could talk about we'll talk about that sort of thing some more. But if you want to bring it back to risk, at least for the Stoics, there is that Stoicism does give you the freedom to take these external risks to make great art, uh, shoot for that maybe more risky career, which if it is most likely not going to work out, but if it does work out, it's going to be socially beneficial, and so on. So to bring things back, at the very least, Stoicism gives a lot of room, and even I think a psychological aid for taking risks that are very important. That certain people are called to do.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end it in terms of that idea of stoicism. Yeah, is provides a psychological aid to take the risks that people are called to do. I think that's a nice way of putting it. And that's in the external world, and then also while focusing us on the real risk, which is not living up to your internal potential as well, and keeping that focus on that. I think that's a nice idea. Anything else you wanted to add on the Stoics on risk?
No, that's perfect.
Great,
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
thanks, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.